Okay, if you were with us last week, you remember we went through a litany of northern kings, and I mentioned to you one of the major reasons that's all laid out is so that we can get to King Ahab, who sort of is the bottom of the barrel in terms of kings of the northern kingdom of Israel. He's the worst of the worst, and he's going to pretty much consume anything we talk about with the northern kingdom all the way to the end of this book. And he is going to be sort of juxtaposed with the prophet Elijah. Now, even if you're somewhat unfamiliar with the stories of the Bible, you probably may have heard of the prophet Elijah, a pretty famous guy. And so today we're going to get introduced to him and the way in which he steps in, speaking on behalf of God, to confront the king and the idolatry that he has brought amidst the people. So, if you have a copy of the Scriptures, you can turn to 1 Kings chapter 17. If not, no worries. We've got it on the screen here for you. This is what it says. Now Elijah, the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead, said to Ahab, "As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word." Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah, "Leave here, turn eastward, hide in the Kerith ravine, east of the Jordan. You will drink from the brook, and I have directed the ravens to supply you with food there." So he did what the Lord had told him. He went to the Kerith ravine, east of the Jordan, and he stayed there. And the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. Sometime later, the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. Then the word of the Lord came to him, "Go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there." So if you're familiar at all with ancient Near East geography, which I imagine you are probably not, so I'm pausing to talk about this. Sidon would be sort of modern-day Lebanon or Syria, kind of north and against the Mediterranean Sea, north of Israel and against the Mediterranean Sea. And Sidon is the land from which Jezebel, who became the wife of Ahab, we learned last week, that's where she comes from. So God is sending him up into that region up there. He says, "And stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you with food." So he went to Zarephath, and when he came to the town gate, a widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and asked, "Would you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink?" A bold question to ask a widow in the midst of a drought. Yeah. And as she was going to get it, he called, "And bring me, please, a piece of bread." Wow. "As surely as the Lord your God lives," she replied, "I don't have any bread. Only a handful of flour in a jar, a little olive oil in a jug. I'm gathering these sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son so we can eat it and die." In other words, this is our last meal. Elijah said to her, "Don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said. But first, make me a small loaf of bread from what you have and bring it to me. And then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land." She went away and did as Elijah had told her, so there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and for her family. For the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word the Lord had spoken by Elijah. Sometime later, the son of the woman who owned the house became ill. He grew worse and worse, and finally he stopped breathing. She said to Elijah, "What do you have against me, you man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son?" "Give me your son," Elijah replied. He took him from her arms. He carried him up to the upper room where he was staying, and he laid him on his bed. Then he cried out to the Lord, "Lord my God, have you brought tragedy even on this widow I'm staying with by causing her son to die?" Then he stretched himself out on the boy 3 times and cried out to the Lord, "Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him." the Lord heard Elijah's cry, and the boy's life returned to him, and he lived. Elijah picked up the child, carried him down from the room into the house. He gave him to his mother and said, "Look, your son is alive." Then the woman said to Elijah, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth." The word of God for the people of God. Okay. So in this story, we have Elijah, by God's command, pronouncing or proclaiming a drought in the land that's going to last a number of years. And we are meant to see, as readers of this story, the profound obedience of Elijah as God's messenger or agent. Think about this for just a second. God knocks on your door, awakens you in a dream, however God speaks to you, right? Or however God would have chosen to speak to his prophets in the Old Testament. We kind of have this dreamed up idea of what it might have been, but none of us were there. We don't know how he did it, right? But God speaks to you and says, "Hey, you know that king who's the worst king you could ever possibly imagine? The king who has set up idols all over the capital city, who's married foreign women, who's brought catastrophe on the whole land? I want you to go to him. Like, don't send him a letter. Don't send him an email. Don't text him, right? I want you to go to him right into the capital city, right past the temple of Baal, right past all the altars and the cults. Go into his palace, and I want you to say to him, the living God," right? So immediately you're denouncing the gods he's serving. "The living God has announced a drought on you." Now, this is pretty bold stuff. Would you sign up for a mission like that? I would probably not, right? We don't get to hear the negotiating that goes on, but my guess is there was some level of negotiation, right? Elijah's human, just like us, and yet he goes. But you might be asking yourself, why would God send a drought? What a strange thing to do. But there's real reason for this, and it's really important to understand this. The first and foremost reason that God announces a drought is this is exactly what he's told his people from the beginning of their covenant relationship with him. That if they serve other gods, he will cause drought to come on the land. That is, the productivity of their land is exactly commensurate to their fidelity to him. Does that make sense? Now again, they lived in a different experience of life than we do, and it's hard to do a one-to-one in any way. But this is the reality. So this is what it says in Deuteronomy chapter 11. It says, "Be careful, or you will be enticed to turn away and worship other gods and bow down to them." Exactly what they did. "Then the Lord's anger will burn against you, and he will shut up the heavens so that it will not rain, and the ground will yield no produce, and you will soon perish from the good land the Lord is giving you." So God's doing exactly what he told them he would do, right? And anyone who knows anything about that would understand. So that being said, friends, whenever you are reading in the Old Testament in your regular devotional reading or engagement with scriptures, and you see drought pop up, these verses should come right to mind. There's something wrong between the people and God, that drought is happening there. So a famous place that it happens, if you're familiar with the story of Ruth in the Old Testament, remember the story of Ruth? That whole book begins with what? A drought in the land. And Elimelech, instead of returning to God, goes out to Moab to try to find food on his own, kind of making things worse. So this is just an understanding of God's economy in the Old Testament. So should have been of no surprise to any of the people that this was happening. However, the choice of a drought is even more provocative than that, because who is the God that King Ahab has brought into the capital city? Remember, it's the god Baal, as we say in English, or if you want to speak Hebrew, Baal, right? Baal. And this god was a Canaanite god, specifically from the areas of Sidon and Tyre, but also kind of throughout the whole land of Canaan before Israel came in the conquest of it post-Exodus. And Baal was a significant god to them because he was the weather god. He was the god who brought rain on the land. which of course became the most significant god because living in an agrarian society and economy, that's what you needed the most, was regular rain. And so the people did what they needed to do to keep Baal on their side so that he would come through for them and rain on the ground so there would be produce. And in essence, what God is saying through Elisha to this worshiper of Baal is, our God is the only God. Our God is the God who controls the heavens and the rain, not this made-up Canaanite God. So now, knowing the behind the scenes, let's talk again about Elisha's obedience. Because he's not just announcing something interesting, right? He's not just giving a weather forecast. When he comes in and announces drought to Ahab, he is poking him in both eyeballs. Would you sign up for it? Would you do it? And here we have Elijah marching in. And yet, the most profound reality of Elijah's obedience for me is not that he's willing to go there and announce this message, because at some level, this is a power move, isn't it? But at some level, it kind of would feel good at some level to be announced, to know from God, and to be able to announce to an enemy that you're in trouble, right? But the profound nature of Elisha's obedience is actually seen in his powerlessness after proclaiming the message. It is, and listen to this well, church, that Elijah doesn't just get to proclaim the message and then go on vacation, right? It used to be a guy on TV called Survivor Man. Remember Survivor Man, Les Stroud from Canada? And then on the heels of him, there were all these other guys who would come in and show you how to survive in these situations. But Survivor Man's claim to fame always was that he went alone and he filmed all of his own stuff. And it came out that these other guys, they would come in and film these things and then at night go to a swanky hotel, get a nice shower, and come back the next day, right? Well, Elijah doesn't get to do that. He's Survivor Man in this analogy, if it's connecting with you. If not, just let it go, right? That is that he's not just announcing drought, he's got to live in the midst of the drought. We forget this sometimes as Christians, don't we? That God calls his messengers and his people not just to speak truth, but to live in the midst of the brokenness in faithfulness while we also speak truth. And Elijah's obedience is most profoundly seen in his willingness to be utterly dependent upon God in the midst of a brokenness that at some level, at least, he has no cause in. Right? And so he goes off to the Kidron Valley, Kerith Ravine, and he's fed by ravens. What a glamorous lifestyle that must have been, yeah? He goes down and he drinks from the brook, fair enough, but there's no food to be had, so he is reliant on the ancient version of DoorDash called ravens, right? And the ravens would swoop in, and apparently they'd drop him bread. That sounds okay, doesn't it? But let's remember also that the Jewish people were never allowed to eat a raven. It was forbidden for them to eat a raven because ravens were unclean. So anything from the mouth of a raven would have also been seemingly unclean. So the bread, even the bread he brought, would have been not so great. But then it says he also brought meat. Now, I was hanging out with the Stacks community group yesterday, and I asked them the question over lunch. What kind of meat do you think a raven would bring for Elijah? Filet mignon? A nicely broiled or grilled chicken, right? Seems to me that ravens are prolific in finding dead animals and kind of scavenging in them and bringing them over. Now, can we know for sure that's the meals that Elijah was dining on in the midst of this drought? No, but there's a million birds that God could have chosen, And he specifically says ravens for a reason. Yeah? So again, are you signing up for this? Delicious gourmet dinners delivered by ravens. I remember when I was a kid, I was probably in high school. My mom had surgery, and our church that we grew up in, being a great church, kind of rallied around, and they started a meal train, and all of a sudden these meals would show up. And I quickly learned to not like church meal trains. So when I became the pastor of this church, and by the way, we're prolific at meal trains here, but if you've had one, they're darn good, aren't they? You can thank your pastor for that. Because when meal trains were brought up, I expressed some of my personal experiences with rogue casseroles delivered by ravens to my door and my mother's recuperation. Right? So imagine like this steady dish of meal while you're waiting. When is God going to tell me that I can tell them there's rain? Utterly dependent upon God. And then one day, the stream goes dry. Now, certainly you are believing that God has put you here for a reason, and he's going to provide these things for you. And he says, oh, by the way, okay, the stream's dry. Now go to enemy territory, right? You know that queen who's made Ahab even worse because she kind of hates your people, and you'll see that in the next chapters as we get further into this book. Go to her native land. It'll be good for you there. And he's like, oh, and I've got the perfect benefactor for you. Someone who's going to have everything you could possibly need. A widow, right? Of course, in that society, widows would have been typically utterly dependent upon others for their own survival. And God says to Elijah, you're going to be dependent upon her. Imagine getting that message. And up he goes, and God radically provides for him. Friends, God has called his people not just to know the truth and not just to make the truth known, but to live in dependence upon him in a broken world who are in need of knowing that truth. That is equally as powerful as Elijah's proclamation in the face of the king was the example of his utter dependence upon God in the midst of the drought for all the people to see. You believe that? Because so often in our lives, we despise the meals brought to us by God through ravens and widows, don't we? And we just believe that we're deserving of so much more for all that we're doing for God in this place. And we forget the mission that God has called us to. We ought not despise, but we ought to have eyes to see as God's people and to glorify in the proverbial roadkill that the raven drops off for our sustenance. Have you ever been in a season where God has met you in your need in a surprising way? And how quick it is for us to overlook those things in a modern, Western, individualistic world where we are people who make ourselves something rather than people who are actually equally as dependent upon God as Elijah was in this ravine. Stunning obedience, and yet this is our call. I'm not saying to you, you've got to change what you eat or where you live, but I am saying we ought to know our true posture as people who have been given the great responsibility of bearing the message of the gospel of God to this world. That we are not people who get to swoop in, deliver the message, and go off, right? But instead, God says, a major way you will deliver the message is by living in this broken, hard, challenging, difficult, you could describe it as a drought world, in utter dependence on me. So, question for you then. Why does God send Elijah to Sidon? Because he could have just done the raven thing, and that would have been far enough for us to understand the message, right? We get it. But God says, no, I'm going to let the brook dry up. I'm going to send you up there. And I think there are at least 3 reasons. There are probably more, but these 3 sit heavy on my heart as I consider this text this week. The first reason is I think that God wanted to proclaim his superiority to Baal in his homeland, right? That is, it was one thing to announce God's superiority in God's land, but no, God intends and always has to send his people to the ends of the earth to declare the glory of God and the greatness of God in the midst of all things. And so off Elijah goes to the land of Sidon to make God's glory known. What's fascinating here, isn't it? I mean, utterly fascinating is that this widow, when Elijah shows up, she's gathering sticks, and Elijah's like, hey, give me some bread and some water. Like, crazy thing to ask. But this widow refers to his God as the living God. Did you catch that? And we don't know how this is possible. Like, has God revealed something to her? Did Elijah, in a previous statement that's not recorded in this conversation, did he in a previous statement refer to God himself as the living God? Is she being sarcastic? Right? Is she looking at the land and seeing barrenness everywhere? We just don't know. We have no way of knowing. We could guess any of those things, but it would be an utter guess. However, the significance is that she has asked, by saying that, she has framed the whole encounter between Elijah and her son around that proposition. That is, who is the living God? Which God is the real God? Which one is alive and well in the midst of our death and depravity and barrenness? Now, I told you already that the god Baal was the weather god who would bring rain on the land, and it was his rain that he brought on the land that allowed the land to grow produce and vegetation and sustenance from which the people gained their vitality and their life. Their life was gained through Baal. And yet, in this story, we see the superiority of God to Baal. That is, that God doesn't just say, okay, I'll prove it to you, I'm going to make it rain. Spoiler alert, that'll happen in 2 weeks. Pause next week for Easter, come back the week after that. God's going to make it rain, right? He's going to prove himself in that way. However, instead of doing that, he miraculously allows flour and oil to multiply itself. That is, that our God is not just able to provide for us by controlling the weather. He actually supersedes that and is able to provide for us by his own power and glory. Is that he can multiply and make available anything that is necessary for the sustenance of his people, even outside the natural order of how society functions and how rain causes the land to grow. This multiplying reality of flour and oil is both meant to show a need for daily dependence upon God, right? He doesn't show up the first day and unload a giant truck of flour at the widow's house. They've got to believe it daily, right? But it's also showing that he doesn't need the normal order of things in order to provide for his people. He's far superior even to that. That God is not just the means by which we get rain, he's the means by which we get sustenance, however he chooses to give it to us. Even more significant is this idea of the living God. And if you are a student of ancient Near Eastern culture, this might be jumping up in your brain or in your heart. Because there was something in the ancient Near Eastern world in the Canaanite area called the Baal cycle. Ever heard of this before? Anyone? No? Okay, nerd out with me for just a second. And archaeologists have found this from the ancient city of Ugarit and other places. This incredible thing that there's stories and narratives and mythology around this. They actually believe there were several Canaanite gods, right? Asherah, a female god who we hear about often, the Asherah poles that go up, Baal, the weather god. And then there was the god Mot, M-O-T, Mot, who was the god of death, he was the god who brought death. And the gods would go through this cycle of who was in charge. They were always fighting each other for power and for a glamorous palace that they could be in charge of. And Baal would be in charge of it, and when he was in charge of it, the rains would come, and then Mot would overcome Baal, and in essence, he would kill Baal, and then Mot would be in charge, and those would be the seasons of drought in the ancient world. And then eventually, Baal would be raised to life again, and there would be rain again, and Mot would succumb to him. There was this cycle that would go on and on and on. And so, using this word of the living God, or the God who brings life, or who is alive, Elijah and God is not only challenging the singular Canaanite god of Baal, but their whole theistic structure, theistic pluralistic structure, and understanding that no, God is the God over life and death and all things. And how do we know that's front and center? Because how this whole story ends. That it's not just that there's no flour and oil besides of God's provision, but the boy gets sick, and he struggles to breathe, and he dies. And who is it that brings him back to life? It's God. God is the resurrector and the agent of life. And so in this singular experience, though it would be hard for us at surface level to fully understand, we can see that God is announcing himself as the God, superior to all other would-be gods. And it's why, at the very end, the widow can say, "Now I see." Because maybe earlier she was able to say, "Oh yeah, your God is on level playing field with Baal, or maybe greater than Baal." But when he usurps death and brings back life, now she can see that he is the living God, and his word comes from the mouth of Elijah. Fascinating. Listen to this, friends. God has always intended for the whole world to know him for who he is. It is not a rogue occurrence that God sends Elijah to Sidon. He has always intended for the whole world to hear, know, and respond. In fact, it was a major reason why he gathered Israel as his people, so that they would be a people who worshiped him radically, that is, not just in their rites and their ceremonies and their songs, but in the whole way they ordered their lives. So that, it says in Exodus and Deuteronomy, so the worlds and the nations around them would see them and would come to them and would know their God and respond to that. We see pieces of that in the kingdoms of David and of Solomon, but now we see the exact opposite, don't we? That Israel has given up on all of that. Instead, they've embraced the gods of the world and are just like them. And so in the face of that, God says, "So I'll go. And I'll do what Israel is not." And he's showing Elijah who he is in so doing, and he's showing all of Israel what they're meant to be and to do. First reason God goes to Sidon, or God sends Elijah to Sidon, to show his superiority to Baal and the gods of Canaan. Second reason God sends Elijah to Sidon is because he is deeply interested, not just that the people would know him fully well, not just that they would that this widow would be able to encounter him in a profound way, not just that he would be able to demonstrate life and the power of life over death, but he's also attempting to do something, I think, of particular nature in the heart of Elijah himself. That is, and you may know, I mean, the sort of the climactic moment of the book of 1 Kings in some way is coming up in the next chapter, in chapter 18, where all these prophets of of Baal are going to face off against Elijah on top of Mount Carmel. And there's going to be a sort of like a huge moment of God's power on display versus the gods of this world. And it's going to be a moment where Elijah is going to have to exude utter faith and dependence upon God. And there's this buildup to it, isn't there? Where God is demonstrating who he is to Elijah. He says, okay, go and tell the king there's drought coming. And he does that, and God preserves him. I'm going to go into this valley over here, and the ravens will meet you. And he does that, and God provides for him. And now go up to Sidon and ask a widow for help. And he does that, and he sees God miraculously provide for him. That is that Elijah is getting a front row seat to the goodness, the faithfulness, the power, the majesty of God. And it is preparing him in some way for this next season. Listen, friends, so too in our lives, yeah? That even in ways we don't yet understand, God is preparing us for what is next. Now listen, do not make the radical one-to-one connection of you to Elijah. Probably not right to do, right? God is preparing Elijah for something major and for something special. So it's kind of other. But in smaller ways, we can see that in our lives and how God is developing us for the next step of faith. That he's not just calling us to some out-of-nowhere radical thing. Every once in a while he does that, yeah? But he's demonstrating his faithfulness and his power along the way so that when that moment comes, we have the ability to take that step. But God is not just demonstrating his power and his might to Elijah. He's also, I believe, building in Elijah the right kind of heart. Listen, it would have been somewhat easy for a faithful man of God like Elijah to really dislike Ahab and Jezebel, right? I mean, they're thumbing their nose at faithful Jewish people left and right. They're leading Israel into all kinds of corruption. He's a bad king. Bad things are happening. You know, at some level, being able to say, hey man, you stink, drought is coming, easy enough to do. But I think God is saying, hey, what I'm doing here is not just about hating your enemy. It's about developing a love for all the people who are deceived by false gods. Why is it, do you think, that God allows Elijah to build a personal relationship over a number of years with this family? What is the reason for that? I mean, is it just so that he can see new flower every day? I mean, that's part of it, yeah. But it's not. By the end of this story, we see the deep connection that Elijah has to this mom and her son. I mean, when this son dies, Elijah is distraught because he stretches himself over the boy, right? And Elijah has become part of that family. And at some level, God is meaning to open Elijah's heart, not just in frustration against false truth, but in a desire for people who are deceived by false truth to be set free and to know God for who he really is. Friends, in our world, the church in so many ways loves to rage against what they see as wrong. Easy to do, right? Even easier. You don't have to get a plane ticket to Samaria and meet Ahab face to face. You can go right on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter or X or Blue Sky or wherever you do your social media bidding, right? And I'm not here to be social media police or to tell you what you can and can't post or whatever. We're meant to know what truth is. I think there's a way to do that. I happen to think social media is largely ineffective. However, you better be doing that not just out of a heart that says, I know truth and I'm going to show you. It better be a heart that says, my heart is broken because so many are deceived by false gods and I know the living God. How that would change our interaction with this world and our willingness to keep living in the brokenness of the drought for the sake of the world that God loves. We say we want to love the things that God loves. It starts with people. And here, God is doing something radical in the heart of Elijah, that by the end of it, he's pleading for this life of an idol worshiper. So much so that he is getting in his mess, right? He lays down on his dead body and stretches himself over it. First of all, at first glance, I'm like, what is that? This is weird, right? But it's meant to be a narrative picture of Elijah's complete association of himself with the boy. Owning his death, willing to take his place, and therefore advocating to God from that position for new life and total resurrection. Kind of sounds like a story we know, yeah? That God so loved the world. Who was the world? People deceived by false gods and false truth. That he sent his son, probably theologically better to say, that he came, right? God proper comes. If you want to get Trinitarian, the Father sends the Son. But God comes, right? He's not sending a scapegoat. He's coming himself. To do what? Jesus says, I've not come to condemn the world. Shouldn't he? I mean, this whole world has thumbed their nose at him. Doesn't he need to just come and declare truth and say, hey, tough nuggets, man. You're on the wrong side of history here. So not to come to condemn, I've actually come to associate with you even in your death. That is that Jesus has stretched himself over the death and the depravity of this world. On the cross of Christ, which we will remember this Friday, Jesus is figuratively stretching himself over our death, associating himself with it, taking it on himself, and from that position advocating to the Father for new life and resurrection. And listen to me, in the very same way that God answered Elijah's prayer, yes, God answers Jesus' prayer, yes. This is who you are. This is who I am. This is who God is. He is after the hearts of all these people. You see, friends, there's no real reason, is there, for this widow when Elijah shows up and says, hey, here's a cool idea. Give me water and bread. And she says, I've got nothing. He's like, okay, it's going to be all right. You go home and make that last meal. Just give me the first portion of it. Right? A super bold thing for a stranger to ask someone. We don't do that in the Northeast, at least, you know. But the woman does it. Maybe the most stunning thing of this whole story, right? She's like, okay. Now, there could be any number of reasons for this again, right? Maybe Elijah told, there's more to it, and Elijah said, listen, I'm telling you, it's going to work. You just got to do it, maybe. Or maybe she's like, what else? What other hope do I have, right? My last lottery ticket. It's the Hail Mary at the end of the big game. This is all I've got left. This is worth a try. Could it have been that way? Sure. But I want to suggest to you it's actually something profoundly different. It's that God had begun working on her heart long before Elijah ever got there. Did you catch what was written in verse 9 of this chapter? It says, go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you with food. This is not hard determinism where she's some robot. No, it's the God of the universe already at work in her heart, opening it up to be able to respond to him. This message, this gospel message of rescue that God intends to announce to the whole world, he has gone ahead of all of his messengers to work on the heart of the hearers so that when the message is announced, as crazy as it might seem in the moment to us announcing it, right? Hey, make me that last final loaf of bread. Like, we don't say that, but it feels weird sometimes when we're telling this gospel story, right? How are they going to understand this? Well, do you believe that God is already ahead working in the hearts of the people? You know it's true because it's been part of your story, has it not? So friends, if you have been the recipient of new life because Jesus has stretched himself over your dead body and granted you resurrection life, then I tell you that you also have been sent into this drought of a world with a message. Few of us, like Elijah, maybe none of us in this room, like Elijah, are going to be called to go to the king. But you are called in your spheres of influence, like all the other faithful prophets who are in Israel, who we'll hear about in the next chapter, who don't get the glamour moments, but live in their spheres of influence in a life ordered in worship to God in the midst of a drought. You get to go, and you get to know truth. And sure, you get to speak truth, and you should, but you to live in utter dependence upon God in that place, showing people what hope in the midst of drought looks like, why you can have it, and therefore what the gospel means. But you will only do it if you have come to have a heart like God's, who desires that every man and woman would know him. Have you gotten close enough to your neighbors that your heart has begun to open up in small ways that you would want them to know it? Listen, we are not Elijah. In so many ways, Jesus is the epitome of Elijah in this story. And yet, we carry the name of Christ wherever we go. So if Christian means little Christ, in this story, Christian means little Elijah. God says, I've got a great plan for you. You're like, heaven? That sounds great. In a little bit. For now, I'm going to send ravens. It's going to be great. There'll be bread and there'll be meat. And then when the stream dries up, I might send you to Sidon. To your workplace, or outside of your little sphere of closeness. And I might open your heart to more people. And you might see me move in even more powerful ways that deepen your faith and belief in this mission. And then, the rain is going to come. Jesus will come back and make all things new again. You will see that final moment of great glory. But will you be obedient as his messenger in this time? You pray with me?